Whether you climb the corporate ladder or launch your rocket, your flight path begins with strategic gravity. Future CXO aspirants, up next is a fireside chat with our guest speaker, Kalyani Tandon. She is the former Chief Accounting Officer at Intapp as well as Sun Microsystems. Kalyani is a global finance executive with a 40-year career, having led IPOs and financial operations for companies like Sun Microsystems, Intapp, and other organizations. Kalyani is a chartered accountant and CPA. She has played a key role in shaping financial strategies in the tech and professional services industries. Passionate about giving back, she serves on the boards of non-profit organizations and actively supports diversity and inclusion initiatives. A trained Bharatanatyam dancer, she balances finance with a love for the arts and outdoors. The fireside chat on how to ascend the C-suite in a global corporation and pivot to taking a startup to NASDAQ. Let's give a warm Global CXO Summit welcome to Ms. Kalyani Tandon and our very own Dr. Saxena. On stage, please.
Okay, such a pleasure to hear from Sanjay, and now you'd be surprised what's in store for you when we talk to Kalyani. So thanks so much. She's the real power behind Sanjay's success. But you know what? She's an amazing person in her own right, and you just hear from her. She's got some fantastic views from around the world. And one of the things I'd really like to ask you, Kalyani, firstly is, thank you so much for coming from so far away. But tell people around here, we've heard of CFOs in India, but what is a Chief Accounting Officer?
Mudit, first of all, thank you all for inviting us here. I think Sanjay and I are very happy to be able to have this opportunity to come and meet with all of you and share with you some of our experiences. So to answer your question, yes, the CAO is the Chief Accounting Officer. It's a role which I think got created relatively recently, I would say. In the old days, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, used to be responsible for everything across finance. So that meant investor relations, it meant the budgeting and financial planning processes, and it meant the accounting organization and the financial reporting, and also compliance. And as things have developed, as business has become more complicated, and as regulations have become more stringent, that role became, I think, honestly, probably in many cases, too much for one individual. And also what tended to happen was we were seeing a trend where CFOs used to be people who were originally educated as accountants, right? It was a numbers game. It was, you had to know finance, you had to know numbers, and the route to CFO was being a chartered accountant or being a CPA. That started to change. A lot of companies started to hire people who were from investment banking backgrounds, who were potentially even lawyers, and these people did not have the fundamentals of accounting, technical accounting. And so I think it became natural to, in a way, segment the roles, and particularly in larger corporations, CFOs didn't really want to have what they considered the basic, and I don't want to say back office because that sounds demeaning of the role. It isn't a back office role at all, actually. But they didn't want to have that responsibility. Their focus was on investor relations. It was on partnering with the CEO to do strategy, to do investments. So that was where they wanted to focus. So the CAO role developed to focus on external reporting, compliance, and really the regulatory side of things. So my job, both in Sun Microsystems and also in the startups that I did and the company that I took public, was to take that role. I was responsible for all of our external reporting. When we were SEC, we were doing all of our Ks and Q filings, any other regulatory filings. I would be responsible for doing acquisitions and also doing both the accounting as well as the diligence and also the absorption of those companies and how we integrated them into our own processes and systems. And then there was another aspect which occurred, particularly in America, which is because of the failure of Enron and the implosion of Arthur Andersen, which is a big accounting firm. As a result of that, there was a move to increase regulation, and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was brought into force. And that was all around internal controls and compliance. So that was another very large area that companies had to devote a lot of time and focus to. And so that also became a big part of the role that I had to play, was developing processes and internal controls around financial reporting and regulatory requirements to ensure that what we were putting out was accurate information, complete, and as full information as we should about the company. So that was really now what a CAO does versus what a CFO does.
Amazing. I mean, frankly, it's quite a revelation to me too. and thanks so much for sharing it with everybody. But you mentioned numbers, right? Now tell me, I mean, how does somebody who's done and studied geography at King's College in London go on to do numbers? In India, if you went and did geography, man, that was the end of you. Right? And obviously meant you can't add, you can't subtract, and that's why you're doing geography. But this is an amazing story. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. Well, I don't know about you, but when I was 18 and had to make those choices, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a lot of things that I knew I did not want to do. My mother was a doctor, my father was an engineer, and I had checked those boxes off, and I'm like, nope, nope, nope. And frankly, at that point in time, I grew up in the UK. I had my education there, and it was fairly open in terms of your ability to go to university and just pick a subject. And I enjoyed geography. Frankly, I was at the stage I didn't have a career in mind. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but all I knew was, well, I enjoyed geography at school, so okay, let me go and do my degree. I did my degree in geography, and then, of course, reality strikes, right? You'd say, well, I now have this BA. What exactly am I going to do with it? And the answer was, well, you could go into teaching. That didn't really appeal. And then I had to really start thinking. The good news was that, again, in the UK, they had good careers advice. They had careers people who would help graduates like myself who hadn't really got a career or a firm game plan in mind to look at what the options and alternatives were. And again, in the UK, the system for accountants and even for lawyers, actually, is that even if you have done a non-relevant degree, you can actually pivot at that point of time and move into either accounting or into law. And I ended up choosing accounting. I tossed up, it pretty much was a flip of a coin. I could have gone either way, but I ended up with accounting. And the good thing about accounting, again, in the UK, is you're trained by the company, right? You do 4 years with them. You're working with them at the same time that you're being trained, and you're doing your exams. So it's a pretty rough and tough road, but it's also a very fulfilling one, because that whole experience, the things that you gain when you are being trained, that is the thing that I feel was the foundation for me for the rest of my career, was that initial training and that getting the chartered accounting qualification.
Absolutely. I think the UK has a very good internship system, right?
Yes.
They take you in, and so I must say that's really helped, because the world would never have seen an accountant after studying geography. Definitely not in India, for sure, I can assure you. But let's move on. You pivoted from geography to accounting, right? And I'm sure there have been many pivots in your life and a lot of career inflection points, right? So tell us a little bit about those points in your life, right? The promotions, the changes, what has happened and how have you sort of grown through that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think if I look back on it, I would say there's probably 3 major pivots that happened in my life. The first we talked about, well, that's sort of pre-first. That was my initial pivot into accounting. But I then started working for KPMG. I was on track with them. I was working in London, doing a lot of work with various industries, various companies, enjoying the work and progressing, as I thought, towards a partnership position in the firm. But it was also becoming apparent to me that working in the UK, it was, this was, I won't tell you, but you can probably guess, quite a few years ago, where it was still very much an old boys network. It was who was supporting you within the firm for those promotions. And it was difficult to differentiate yourself. You were just another one of very many people who were all sort of trying for that same goal. And at that point, an opportunity presented itself to me, which was one of the partners I worked for asked me if I would be interested in doing a rotational assignment to go and work for a technology audit client that was in the United States. And I would still be working with KPMG, I would still be auditing the client, but I would be doing it stateside. And I was very fortunate in that my parents were very supportive of me at that time, and they said, if that's a good thing for you, your career, and that's what you're interested in, you should go ahead and do it. And that, I think, was the first turning point for me. I think that opened up a completely new geography, a completely new set of companies that I was dealing with, a different culture, because the British and the US cultures are very different. And I found the US culture actually much more open to me as a woman and as a woman of color. So I actually enjoyed that experience a lot. And that was also one of the things that then ultimately led me to deciding to move to the United States. The second pivot, I would say, was my decision to leave the profession, to leave KPMG and not continue to pursue the partnership track, which I did. I continued to pursue it for a number of years, even in the US. I qualified myself as a CPA, which was necessary to become a partner in the US. But then I eventually decided that that was not the path I wanted to take. And I decided that there was a lot of interest and opportunity that was outside of the profession. And I chose to go, and I got the opportunity to work at Sun Microsystems. And that was, again, another pivotal role for me. I was hired actually by the controller at the time, a lady called Robin Denholm, and you may have heard of her name. She is now the chairman of Tesla, and Sanjay kept talking about Tesla, but she was my boss at Sun, and then she continued on in her career to do many other CFO roles, and then ultimately now to become the chairman of Tesla. But she hired me into Sun, and that is where I got the experience and the exposure of a multinational. And I got promoted there relatively quickly, actually. And I put that down to that foundational experience, the credibility that I had in my technical skill set, right? I came from KPMG, which was, I had that clear technical background, which Sanjay kept talking about, which is that core competency that you have to have. But then you also have to develop those soft skills, right? You have to develop, in my case, operational expertise, not just being the technical accountant. How do you then become the business partner? How do you add value to the other functions? How do you lead and guide and provide the input, let's say, to the sales team, right? The sales team is charged with driving revenue growth, but the accounting for revenue can be very complicated. So how do you then partner with them to train them, to create structures to make it easier for them to do business? How do you create standardized contracts so that they're not coming to you every time they want to negotiate a clause, right? You tell them, here are the rules, the basic fundamentals. You develop those kind of skills, you develop that partnering, you develop the proactiveness, right? so that you are now seen as someone who can be helpful. You're not the person who's viewed as the one who always says no, right? We have this reputation in finance, I think, and that's usually if it's not a highly effective finance organization, of being the ones that say no to people, right? Oh, go to finance, they're going to say no to you. That's not a good, highly effective finance organization. A good, effective finance organization is one that has learned how to shape the work that they have to do to help you manage the business appropriately within the rules, right? And they're proactive in doing that and really helping drive the business growth. So that is the second pivot. And then the third, I would say, is that move away from the multinational. After Sun was acquired by Oracle, I decided that, again, I had gained a certain type of experience with Sun, and I wanted to taste the startup. I was in Silicon Valley, and I said, well, you know what, let me go and try the startup thing. And again, in finance and at the level that I was not going in at the very early stage startup, so I'll be honest about that. It was more the later stage startup that was looking for someone like me to come in and to be able to take them to the next level, right? To take them to the point where they could go to an IPO or would be ready to be acquired or would be able to get that next round of significant funding that would then get them to the IPO. So that was the third pivot, I would say, that really shaped the career. And then ultimately, as I said, at Intapp, that was the company that I did take public.
Amazing. I mean, just look at the pivots, right? Geography to accounting, UK to the US, right? And then Sun Microsystems to Intapp. Amazing. I mean, I would say one needs to be quite brave, quite adventurous, and frankly, I would say that's a great trait to have, to look ahead and to try out something new. So I think that's a great takeaway for a lot of us. But one of the other things, that I'm intrigued about, right? So you have this Sun Microsystems, this huge dominant company, and then you have a startup, right? So what is the difference in in cultures, and what would you, advise people here about, deciding between big company and startup? What is your take on this?
Some of it is obvious, right? Large companies tend to be, and Sun was very matrixed, a very matrixed organization. I myself had a number of peers on the CFO staff, so they were my equivalent level, and they had their own individual responsibilities, but I had to work with them in order to generate the financials, do the compliance aspects. So you have to learn to navigate large organizations. Again, touching on some of the things that Sanjay said, it's about having the ability to influence where you don't necessarily have direct control or authority. It is the ability to communicate effectively and to bring people around where they have to be able to see the reason, the rationale for why you're needing them to do something. And I think in the large corporation, a lot of my role was more management, right? It was oversight. It was ensuring that things were happening. It was leading the teams. And it was, of its nature, more of a review and, as I said, oversight function. Contrast that with the startup. If I look at something like Intapp, I went into it where I had to go in, build a team, first of all, that was capable of doing public company reporting. We had a very rudimentary accounting function when I walked in. We would close the books, but it would take us 30 days to close the books, right? That is not feasible. So they would literally be rolling from 1 month close to the next. Very painful. So I had to rebuild a team. I had to actually create process. I had to create structure. I didn't have people. At Sun, I had teams. If I needed something done, it was usually, Joe, Sarah, Susan, can you please go get this information, let's create the report, let's evaluate and report out. Here I was back to basics. I was doing Excel spreadsheets. I was doing PowerPoint presentations. You have to get your hands dirty. I learned how to do things that I had never touched before. I learned things about HR. I learned things about legal that I had no idea about, because you were actually then the person both responsible as well as the person doing it. So I think that's the biggest difference. In a large corporation, there's an infrastructure, there is a support, there are people that you can go to who will be able to help you. In a startup environment, it's very lean. It's generally faster paced. Decisions need to be made quickly, and you often have to think on your feet, figure it out, and move fast.
Absolutely. I mean, it's trying to make an elephant dance, isn't it? That's Sun Microsystem, and then you have a really an amazingly fast pace. So how does leadership change, right? What was your leadership style in Sun Microsystems, and then suddenly, you're doing things you did 20 years ago, right? Making Excel sheets and doing things like that, your own presentations. How did it change? Tell us about it.
So I think there are certain aspects of leadership that go across organizations. It doesn't matter whether it's a large organization or a small one. I think in my case, I feel like in finance, you have to be viewed as someone with high integrity. So that is without question, right? We are fiduciaries of the company. We're responsible for ensuring that it operates ethically, that its finances are in good order. So that is something which I think is across both the large and the small. And I think people look at you and it's do you walk the walk? You can talk about something and say, oh, you should do this, but they're actually observing you. They're seeing whether you do as you say. And I think that's very important. And I feel like that is something that, again, transcends, right? It doesn't change whether you're at a big or a small company. And building the trust with your colleagues, those things are the same. Because without the trust, you don't get the cooperation and the collaboration and the effective working. So I think there is more actually in common as a leader in those two environments than there is differences. I think the differences are the kind of things that I mentioned before, the way of working, the needing to be much more hands-on versus more managerial per se when you're in a large corporation.
Yeah. I think probably one of the styles also, right, in terms of while you can play a certain role which is more inspirational to your team or more visionary in, let's say, something like Sun Microsystems, you've got to be probably more directional and get things done on the ground, right? Because you're I think both from the customer as well as on top, you're just a step away.
Yes, I mean that is true, but I think ensuring that the team has the bigger picture in both cases is very important, because otherwise the danger is, even in a small company, they become very tactical. And you really want them to see the bigger purpose of what it is they're contributing to, because I think then they're really much more effective.
Absolutely. So great point. And one of the most interesting things about your career is that you've actually taken a startup, right, from where it was to IPO. I mean, the statistics say that 85 to 95% percent of startups sort of just seem to perish. But to take a startup from where it was and right up to IPO, how do you balance the needs of growth, where the startup has to continually demonstrate financial performance, and also be mature enough where you can demonstrate to NASDAQ or the stock market that the team is strong enough and people should invest their money with you. So tell us a little bit about that.
So it was a journey, and with Intapp, it was actually a long journey. they had actually, it's a company that had been in existence for over 10 years when I joined them. So it was what I call a mature startup, but it was bootstrapped. It had not taken outside investment. It was bootstrapped. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was successful, because they had managed their finances. They were sufficiently savvy about how to run the business and grow the business without taking external money for a long period of time. And so they had built they had a very good business model. The company itself, Intapp, you may not have heard of it actually. It's in the software space. It's a software company that had developed software initially for professional services firms, for the legal industry, and for essentially the infrastructure of a law firm. So it would have enabling software for lawyers to be able to do their compliance, their KYC, their intake conflicts, all of those kind of processes. And we grew by acquiring other companies, namely one called DealCloud, which was in the financial services space. And that had a CRM product, and we bolted that on to now be able to address the financial services side. But I would say the company itself, as I mentioned, was relatively mature when I joined it. But what we needed to do, as you said, to demonstrate that we were ready to go public was to build out the infrastructure. And what that meant was across all the functions, right? Build out a sales team that was capable of being able to forecast. Forecasting in the public environment is super critical, right? In the US, you live and die by your quarterly results. That's not how it should be, but that is the reality, right? You have to be able to forecast accurately, and you have to deliver within a very narrow range, usually of your revenue and your earnings. Those are the two metrics that they generally choose to provide guidance. So every quarter, you have to be able to hit that number. And it's a dance. It's a very delicate dance, right? To be able to train your sales force to be able to predict reliably what number they're going to hit, how many contracts they're going to sell. Then my function is translate how they're going to sell that into how that is going to become revenue. Because just because you sold it doesn't mean that it became revenue that quarter. So there was, building that infrastructure on the sales side. There was on the cost side, determining, again, the same thing. How would you determine what you would spend on, how much you'd spend, and ensure that you're sticking with your budgets. So training all your functional leadership to know that they needed to track and manage all of that very carefully. So a lot of it was building what I call that essential infrastructure that was needed to be able to report on an accurate basis. There was the aspect of going out and developing and getting the investors interested in the company and being able to bring them in at the point that we went public and have a good outcome of going public. And then just, building out an organization across all the functions that had experience, I would say, of having been in a public company so that they could then help build that infrastructure as we went.
Amazing. We're in Bangalore, which is a really startup city, right? This is the equivalent of Silicon Valley. And we have a number of students here in the Global CXO Accelerator program who are working in startups. And sometimes, it's very tempting in India for a lot of people to jump into startups, right? So what advice would you give mid-career leaders? When should they look at getting into a startup, or when should they look at, continuing to stay in those huge organizations? I'm sure they will benefit a lot.
That's a tough one, and it's a very personal thing. But I would say the first thing to do is know yourself, right? Know what you enjoy. Be honest with yourself about what it is that excites you about the work that you do and what you want to accomplish. Because I think the startup sounds very enticing. There's a potential financial, benefit if you're at the right level in the organization, if the right outcome occurs, right? and the company goes public or whatever it might be. But it's also a tough road, and it's a very uncertain road, right? It may or may not happen. And as I mentioned, it's a very different way of working. You have to be ready to do things that you've not done before, to get in the details, to get your hands dirty, and work really, really hard to build from the ground up. So it's a tough road. It's definitely not easy. I would also say that do it after you have at least some exposure to a larger company that has had and does have the structures, right? That you've seen what is good or what is great, right? So you know what you should be building towards, right? You have some kind of model in mind. It may not be identical because you're never going to build a structure that a large MNC has for a startup, but at least you know the foundational things, the basic things, right, that you need to have, and you've seen it operating and you've seen what works so that you can come and build that at a smaller scale in the startup. So I would definitely say have some of the bigger company experience that you can take with you when you go into the startup world. But I would definitely also caution you to be just aware. Just be very aware that it's not easy. Definitely not easy.
So it's definitely not for the faint-hearted. It's definitely not for someone who doesn't want to work as hard as what we've heard people talk about. And I think don't just get tempted for the financial benefit that you might see. And I think one of the most important things I'm going to take away from here and for the audience is that at least learn at some stage what is structure and what is system, because when you come into a startup, right, it's mayhem and chaos, right? So have something that you bring to the table. I think, is that something that you...
Very much so. I mean, I think, as I said, I was brought into these startups at the point that they knew they had to pivot. They knew that their existing teams could not take them on the next step of the journey. So they were looking for somebody with that experience under their belt to be able to come in and very quickly, right, put in place the fundamentals, the right structures, the right processes, bring in the right kind of team and build that infrastructure.
Superb. I could just keep talking to Kalyani all day long, but I think what's most important is to open it up to the audience. So Amit, would you like to come and see, we have any questions from the audience? Would anybody... Okay, somebody at the back there, yes, Chandra, can somebody give him the mic?
Thank you, Kalyani ji. Actually, I was able to resonate very well on the startup part that you talked about. Of course, I resonated with the other part, but this one stood out. So I was working in a startup for 6 months, and it was walking on the pan, hot pan. I mean, I'm talking about frying pan. Like, I was asked to do many roles, like even HR, ERP, then IT, which is not at all, I have not even put this one. So my question to you is whether I should learn a skill because I'm interested in a particular skill or because it is required of me, or is it like I should become multifaceted and then acquire skills? That's the question I have.
So are you saying within the startup to do that, or are you saying more generally?
Outside, that made me start to think, because I was always thinking about specialization.
Yeah.
If it is software, it will be software. Of course, I can add management, leadership, and other business acumen, and other horizontal skills. But my experience in the startup has made me curious whether I should also look at other aspects, like as you did, like you went into HR, also like you acquired that skill also. So whether it would be beneficial.
Well, yeah. To be clear, I mean, I did not go into HR, but I had to learn some basics, right? I had to understand the fundamentals. My own personal view is that I think develop something which is your own expertise. I think that is more valuable to you in the longer term. I think you'll always be asked in a startup, particularly if you go to a very early stage one, to put your hand to multiple things. And that's the nature of early stage startups. But I think if you go to something which is slightly later stage, then they are looking for the people who have a specialty that they can then use to help the startup to grow, right? So I think my own view would be decide what your interest is, do that, and then use that as the launching pad to get into a startup that can use that for you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kalyani, for that question. We have one more question.
The companies do look up to your expertise, probably whatever you carry from HR or marketing or finance or the different backgrounds which you probably have evolved over the years. But then as a startup or as a mid-sized growing company, you say that, yes, I need to be looked at differently. You do not carry the same and one size do not fit for all. So how do I really, bring in that expertise as a change management, yet make, good effort to bring value to the organization?
So I think it's as I said. I think you don't take necessarily the structure, right, that was at the larger company, but you take the fundamentals. And I think you always have to look at what stage is your company at. What does it really need? You don't need to have very complicated processes and structures if you're a very early stage company. You just need basic fundamental processes, right? Good process, good controls. Because at the early stage, what they're trying to do is they're trying to develop their product, develop their service, whatever it might be. That is the focus. That's really where they're at. It's only as you get later on in the stage of evolution that they start needing better definition, better process. And I think that's where, if you're a more experienced leader, you can distinguish what is needed at each stage. So you're not going to overcomplicate. You're not going to present an overcomplicated solution for this mid-sized company, right? You're not going to bring that large company process and say, oh, this is what you should have. You're going to tailor it, right? You take it and you say, no, I simplify it. These are the 5 things that you should have, right? These are the critical things that are necessary for you at your stage, and put that in place. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, you have to influence and strike a balance, between what you know and what you could actually bring in. And, that influencing is something which really is required at that moment, right?
Yes, and it's not just about influencing, it's about knowing what is appropriate, right? It's not to say it's wrong, right? It's just that it's appropriate for their level of maturity, right? So I think recognizing the levels of maturity and what is necessary at each stage is what you bring to the table, right?
Thank you. Kalyani.
Thank you very much. Yes,
So,
Amit.
thank you so much
So
for the
I have
wonderful
one.
session.
Hi, Kalyani here. Here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi.
So Sandeep here. I also belongs to Chartered Accountant community from India. So bit technical from finance side, we always hear mostly from our early days that understanding of business where you have to work on. And while at a mid level of career, always I found between 2 pathway, like understanding the business requires more humility to understand, but in the same time people do look after you that ye to seekhne aaya hai. Means he came here to learn, correct? So that goes against you. So how in the journey of understanding the business, you ask relevant questions to understand the requirement of the business, and also because we do know the requirement of the finance side, they do know about requirement of the business side. So how the questions you make relevant, or how you become relevant for all the functions, because ultimately all the functions has cumulative impact on finance, correct? So how you remain relevant to all the stakeholders?
So I have to now go back to my days of audit, and to your point, that is when...
I am from, ex-KPMG and joined industry for last 5 years. So
then you will know from your days at KPMG, right? As you said, it's fundamental to understand the business, because if you don't understand the business, then you don't understand, and you can't identify if there's something wrong in the numbers. But I think, in terms of understanding the business, it's trying to step back, look at the big picture. What are the business drivers? So when you go and you speak to the executives, or you speak to the managers within the organization, it's understanding what are the key things that make the financial lines, right, that go into those. And if you start getting underneath that, then I think that helps you to ask more relevant questions, right, of the people that you're speaking with. I get the sense that you're saying that people don't have patience when you want to ask them that.
I will ask you offline better.
Okay.
Because it will take. But
Just time check, guys. Really sorry. I know everybody wants to ask a lot of questions, but we do have to move to the next parts of the whole day. I request all of you, our guests are still going to be around for both the days, and during the our lunch break times and other break sessions, please do connect. And it'll become easier to get, those specific questions answered. If that's okay with you guys.
Thank you, Monica. That's very succinctly put. So a quick pro tip: when you have a question, write it down so that you see your question first. Because otherwise, what happens is there's a lot of narration, and you don't get the value that speakers like Kalyani and Sanjay and Ram can provide to you, because the question is like a paragraph. All right. On that note, a quick felicitation for Kalyani.
Yeah, Kalyani, another lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kalyani. That was awesome.